Hola a todos, ¿cómo están? Bienvenidos nuevamente a este su espacio amigo Indagando en la Biblia, su espacio de divulgación bíblica independiente sin pertenencia religiosa. Es de mucha alegría para mí reencontrarme con ustedes. Bueno, como cada fin de semana, fiel a nuestro estilo, les comento que hoy tenemos una distinguida invitada. Es un honor para nosotros poder contar con ella. Pero antes de presentarla, quiero saludar a mis dos coanfitriones, al profesor Pedro Rosario y a Adrián Santiago Pérez, el búho de Minerva. ¿Cómo están, chicos? Bienvenidos.
Un placer, Alonso. Gracias. Siempre es grato estar en tu canal.
Gracias, Adrián. Profesor Pedro, ¿cómo está?
Aquí todavía sin tomar café, pero en la disposición de formar parte de este diálogo.
Gracias, caballeros, gracias. Bueno, quiero saludar a nuestra invitada de honor, la profesora Elaine Pagels. Dear Elaine, welcome to Indagando en la Biblia. Thanks to be here.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Bueno, chicos, podemos comenzar con la sesión de hoy día. Vamos a estar hablando sobre el Apocalipsis, descifrando el Apocalipsis, perspectivas históricas y políticas por la profesora Elaine Pagels. Así que, caballeros, podemos empezar la sesión de hoy día, que sé que será una charla muy amena para nuestro público.
Muchas gracias, Alonso. Professor Pagels, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for your time. As you probably know, we're going to be talking about the revelation to John. That's going to be the main focus on. We're going to be talking today, and I think a good place to start is the gospel. Not the gospel. The revelation to John is one of the most, I believe, misunderstood books in the Bible. What do you think this text meant in its original context, and in which ways it's being misunderstood nowadays?
That's a good question. You might say it's simply understood in many different ways. And part of the reason for that is that the language in which John of Patmos speaks is about his visions, his revelations, and they sound like he describes them as if they were kind of dreamlike states. So they're not very specific. There would be angels and demonic beings and beasts and all kinds of strange conflicts, the kind of thing that appears in dreams, which John claims are revelations from Jesus Christ with messages to the churches of his time. But as you say, there are many different interpretations, and that's because John claims to talk about the end of time, and people have been talking about that for thousands of years. I mean, here in the United States, of course, and probably there too, there was an earthquake last week, there was an eclipse of the sun, and many people say, these are the signs. So I would say John, I think, is writing about times in which he's living in the first century. But he's always interpreted and probably intends to speak about the end of time. So it's intentionally mysterious.
Thank you so much. Le pregunté a la doctora Pagels cómo se entendería el libro del Apocalipsis en su contexto histórico y de qué manera a veces se lo tergiversa en el lenguaje, en nuestro contexto moderno. La profesora Pagels me contestó que el lenguaje que utiliza el libro de Revelaciones, el libro del Apocalipsis, se presta precisamente a varias interpretaciones, pero que ciertamente el autor originalmente hablaba de su tiempo. Y lo que ocurre es que hoy en día uno naturalmente lee estas revelaciones que se parecen a lo que uno vería en un sueño y las trata de situar en su contexto histórico. Por ejemplo, hace pocas semanas, bueno, mentira, la semana pasada hubo un eclipse solar, hubo un temblor en Estados Unidos y las personas religiosas entienden tratan de entender esos eventos y los colocan dentro de la simbología del del Apocalipsis.
John actually speaks, about a world which is in conflict between the forces of good and evil, supernatural forces. And I started to write about it when President George Bush, about 20 years ago, was planning to start a war in Iraq, which, as you know, cost the lives of over 100,000 Iraqi people. And he claimed that American bombs in Iraq were fulfilling the prophecies of the book of Revelation. And I was saying, wait a minute, how can he make that claim? It was powerful for many of his Christian audience, but people have been doing that for 2,000 years. And it was a justification of a war that many Americans now regret.
Adrián, por favor, sí.
Sí. Oh, perdón. I thought Pedro was gonna translate. Yes, Dr.
Sorry,
Pagels.
Sorry. Is that I thought I was going to ask the next question, but no sé si vas a traducir, Adrián.
Sí. No.
Sí.
Dr. Pagels made a very interesting observation that when the Iraq invasion happened in 2001, a lot of evangelical Christians actually believed that this fulfilled the prophecies of the revelation to John, and that gave some legitimacy, some religious legitimacy to Bush's invasion of Iraq. And that's unfortunate because these prophecies have been interpreted and reinterpreted for over 2,000 years. So in 2001, they were meant to be applied to. They were interpreted to be applied for the invasion of Iraq. Nowadays, they could be. You could try to read them into the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and this is very silly. I am translating English into English. I'm sorry. Para los oyentes, lo que la doctora Pagels nos está comentando es que el libro de las revelaciones ha sido interpretado y reinterpretado de varias veces, de varias formas. Y en ocasiones esto se presta se ha prestado para la manipulación política. En el 2001, como ustedes saben, hubo la invasión en Irak, y en Estados Unidos un gran segmento del cristianismo evangélico interpretó la invasión en clave apocalíptica, la interpretó como parte del drama que tenía que acontecer llegar al final de los días, parte de las profecías hechas por Juan de Patmos. Y claro, lo que la doctora Pagels acertadamente observa es que esto ha ocurrido durante 2000 años. No es la primera vez que un evento político es tratado de ser interpretado dentro de el contexto del libro de Juan, sino que esto es algo que ha ocurrido muchas veces a través de 2000 años.
Yes. One of the things I wondered about the book of Revelations. I mean, I was, when I was little, I was fascinated by the book a lot. It has such imagery that it attracts the imagination in huge ways. Acabo de decir que cuando yo era pequeño, ¿verdad? Yo veía el libro del Apocalipsis y atraía mi imaginación, ¿verdad? Estimulaba mi imaginación y veía todo eso muy interesante. One of the things that drives me a little bit curious and even a little bit annoyed at certain sectors of society is the the thing that especially in conservative Christianity, that they feel that they are being persecuted right now, you know. And you know that Candida Moss wrote a book about this subject. And the thing is that the book of Revelation seems to have been written in that sort of context when Christians felt they were being persecuted or were being persecuted. You know, my question is what sort of historical evidence?
Yes, that's a very good point. I mean, as you say, it's very powerful images. They're like, the visions of nightmares and dreams. And they really terrify people in many ways. Well, I would say by the time John of Patmos is writing, he's a follower of Jesus, right? And the leaders of all of the major Christian groups have been killed violently. Peter, who was the leader of a group in Rome, had been crucified. And Paul, who was a leader in Asia Minor, which was like Lebanon, Syria, had been beheaded and whipped and tortured. And James, the brother of Jesus, the leader of a group in Jerusalem, had been lynched in Jerusalem, stoned to death. So Christians did feel persecuted, as you say, and they were being persecuted. Their leaders were. It wasn't a mass persecution, as far as we know, but you don't have to kill many people to terrify many. Candida Moss, as you point out, says that Christians today use that kind of language that comes out of people persecuted and exaggerate it for themselves. I think she doesn't understand that you don't have to kill a lot of people to terrify many. If you're trying to destroy a movement, say in New York or New Jersey, if you arrest and torture and kill, say 5 leaders or 4, as happened to these Christians, all of the others would probably hide. It works well enough. It's not the number of people, it's the visibility. For example, Navalny has just been killed in Russia. That's meant to terrify thousands and thousands of people, and it does. So I think the Christians did feel rightly that they were being persecuted. The people she parodies take on that role without that kind of validity.
Sí, lo que la doctora Pagels ha dicho es que una de las cosas que hay que tener en cuenta cuando se mira este contexto histórico es que no toma, ¿verdad?, la matanza de mucha gente para que un cierto grupo se sienta perseguido. O sea que en ese sentido, cuando leemos el libro, por ejemplo, de Candida Moss, de The Myth of Persecution, el mito de la persecución, debemos tener esto en cuenta, de que los cristianos en muchas ocasiones se pueden sentir perseguidos a pesar de que, ¿verdad?, muy poca gente, entre comillas, es perseguida, y a veces no siempre por razones, ¿verdad?, que tienen que ver con el cristianismo. So, thank you very much for your response. And I'm sorry that I left and had to come back again. So,
No problem.
technical problems.
Yeah, there's always technical problems in this type of interviews. Well, in any case, I think one of the things that most modern readers of the Book of Revelations don't know is that the Book of Revelations is actually not unique in antiquity, but it actually was part of a wider literary genre, called apocalyptic literature. So if you could, what are the main characteristics of this apocalyptic literature, and how does the revelation to John fits in it?
Yes, that's a very good point. I mean, the Sibylline oracles, for example, were written by Jews who took the language of the Hebrew Bible and said, God created the world, God is going to end the world, and he will end it by punishing the enemies of Israel. And John of Patmos is in that tradition. As you say, it's a much wider tradition. But basically, in this case, John was a survivor of the Jewish war against Rome that took place between the years 66 and 70 in the first century. And in that war, Jews who were being oppressed by the Roman Empire, the way certain nations are colonized brutally by much more powerful nations, they started a revolution, like the revolution in Spain, the revolution in the United States, for more freedom. But in this case, they lost the revolution, and thousands and thousands of Jews were killed. The center of Jerusalem was utterly destroyed. The temple of God was burned to the ground and desecrated by the Romans, and they planted a Roman garrison in its place. So they lost a terrible war. And John is a survivor. And what he wants is justice. He wants justice for Israel. He wants God to restore his people and give them the land they felt was their land, and bring justice and peace to the world. So he draws on all of the forces of Hebrew prophecy of Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Zechariah in the Hebrew Bible, to say, God will not allow this to happen, and before he punishes all of the nations who have destroyed his own people, he's going to bring a huge catastrophe on the earth and make everything right.
It's interesting that if we want to play a little bit psychologist, not apocalyptic literature in general, it seems to me there is always this anger, frustration, resentment that cannot be properly. It's always the literature of a people that feel that they're being oppressed and that they cannot find justice in the world. So there is this move in which they imagine this future or this other world in which justice will finally be served.
Yes, and of course people have been terribly oppressed. I mean, I would say the Romans were brutal masters to much of the world of the time, and they controlled it. People said they make it a wasteland and call it peace. They just destroy everything. And they did. So people who have been oppressed and want to believe that God is a God of justice and mercy, and he will not tolerate injustice indefinitely, love this text. For example, the people enslaved in the United States at the time of abolition of slavery saw themselves as the people oppressed. They were. And they, in their prophecy, preaching, singing, rejoice in the book of Revelation because it promises that justice will finally prevail. So it's not just resentment, it's suffering. Although I think your psychological analysis is quite accurate as well.
Thank you. Le pregunté le hice la observación a la doctora Pagels de que uno de los errores comunes que hoy en día se comete cuando se lee el libro del Apocalipsis es que uno no sabe, muchas personas no saben de que este libro en realidad no era único en el mundo antiguo, sino que existía un género literario que se llama literatura apocalíptica. Libros muy parecidos a este se escribieron. Tienes las mismas características, un visionario que tiene visiones que le van revelando lo que va a pasar en el final de los tiempos. Y lo que la doctora Pagels nos indica es que esta literatura era generalmente producida por comunidades que se sentían perseguidas, que se sentían oprimidas. Entonces, aquí hay un factor psicológico interesante, que es estas comunidades perseguidas, oprimidas, no encuentran en el mundo justicia, no encuentran en el mundo una forma de ellos sentirse a gusto como están las cosas, y por lo tanto acuden a estas profecías para tratar de imaginar un mundo donde finalmente las injusticias serían rectificadas. Y la doctora Pagels coloca un ejemplo muy interesante. Esto no solamente ocurre en el mundo antiguo, sino que también a través de la historia, la forma que ha sido leída el libro del Apocalipsis, ha tenido esta función. Por ejemplo, en la lucha contra la esclavitud en Estados Unidos, los que se estén oprimidos se regocijaban leyendo el libro del Apocalipsis, porque el Apocalipsis les prometía de que sin importar lo mal que estaban las cosas, Dios no los iba a abandonar y Dios eventualmente iba a hacer de que en este mundo se haga justicia.
Well, you know, whenever there's a natural catastrophe, people think about the end of the world. And John writes, for example, what surprised me when I started to study the book is to see that many of the things that he writes in dreamlike visionary imagery are references to actual events. For example, he talks at the beginning about a huge mountain that explodes and a volcano that explodes and pollutes the sea and destroys thousands of people. And that is a reference to the explosion of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79 that happened during his lifetime. And he, like many people who are steeped in the biblical prophecies, would say, look, that's a sign that the end of time is coming. And so people have taken it so ever since. When there are other explosions, earthquakes, natural disasters, people who love this literature will read that as a sign of the times. And it was that for John. But he writes it in such a open, dreamlike way that you can apply it to almost any situation that you see today. And people have done that for 2,000 years.
La doctora Pagels hace una interesantísima observación. Ella comenta de que hoy en día, cada vez que hay un desastre natural, un eclipse, un terremoto, uno a veces puede estar tentado a tratar de decir, esto es el cumplimiento de lo que dice el libro del Apocalipsis. Sin embargo, ella apunta a de que los eventos que ocurren en el libro del Apocalipsis, a pesar de que están escritos de manera muy simbólica, de una manera que se asemeja a lo que uno vería en un sueño, hacen referencia a eventos concretos que ocurrieron en la vida o en el contexto histórico directo de Juan de Patmos, del autor del libro. Entonces, por ejemplo, en el libro del Apocalipsis se habla de una montaña que explota, que contamina el océano, y eso parecería ser algo muy abstracto, pero en realidad es probablemente una referencia a la erupción del monte Vesubio, el volcán Vesubio, que eso ocurrió aproximadamente en el año 79. Y eso hubiera sido un evento que el profeta, que el autor del Apocalipsis, lo hubiera vivido directamente. Entonces hay que tener sumo cuidado en el momento que uno estudia este libro desde su punto de vista académico, desde su punto de vista histórico, de tener en cuenta que estos símbolos que aparecen en el libro no son símbolos que están completamente que flotan en un vacío histórico, sino de que son en clave simbólica eventos que ocurrieron en la vida concreta del autor original.
But you know what struck me so much reading this book is because the images are so powerful, the demons, the angels, the beasts, images of horror, images of terrible punishment on earth, and images juxtaposed with heaven and the angels and praise to Christ. It's good and evil. And it can be almost plugged into any conflict you have.
Right.
If you look at a massive conflict in the society, say a conflict about war, this book, this is what I learned. It can be read on both sides because the images are so open-ended and dreamlike. So in every war that Christians have engaged since the first century, for example, the Crusades against Muslims occupying Jerusalem, when the King of France went to Jerusalem, he called on people to fight the war of the end time and restore, God's rule in Jerusalem. It's been used in every war ever since, the religious wars of Europe. It's been used in the Civil War in the United States by both sides, saying our side, of course, is the side of God. Your side is evil. And both sides can use it equally because it is so dreamlike and open-ended.
I feel that that's a danger in apocalyptic thinking in general. When I read, for example, the Book of Enoch or the Revelation to John, I can see how this type of literature can really dehumanize the other. You stop thinking of your opponent as another human being who has different objectives than but you start thinking of them as demons, as Satan, as this embodiment of evil. And once you do that move, then you might justify yourself in doing some pretty terrible things too.
That is absolutely right, I think. You see this in our history. I mean, I've seen it. If the enemy is motivated by Satan and pictured as locusts or monstrous beasts, as they are in the book of Revelation, what you have to do is destroy them. And that makes you right. That's why it's been used by people waging war forever on both sides and still is. It's been very powerfully used by American presidents on both sides. For example, of the Civil War, when Lincoln was fighting to end slavery and other Christians were arguing that God endorsed slavery, both of them could use the same book for their sides.
Sounds very
And
interesting.
as you say, demonize the others.
Yeah, that's a very potent danger. I'm gonna go ahead and translate before. This is very interesting, but I feel la doctora Pagels advierte que uno de los peligros que tiene el libro del Apocalipsis es que justamente sus imágenes son tan abstractas, pero siempre tienen este concepto de la lucha del bien contra el mal, ¿no? Entonces, las criaturas que aparecen en el libro del Apocalipsis son demonios, son monstruos, son seres bestiales. Y al ser un libro tan abstracto, es muy fácil tratar de hacer que esos monstruos se conviertan en tu enemigo, ¿no? Entonces, sin importar cuál es la situación actual en la que te encuentres, el libro del Apocalipsis te abre la puerta de poder interpretar tu lucha como esta lucha entre el bien y el mal. Y eso es sumamente peligroso, porque en el momento en el que uno interpreta a tu enemigo como una encarnación del mal, como un satán, como un monstruo, como la bestia, entonces inmediatamente lo has deshumanizado. Y eso es una de las razones por la cual el libro del Apocalipsis ha sido usado y abusado a través de los siglos en contextos de guerra. Entonces, durante las cruzadas se utilizó el Apocalipsis para justificarlas. Y la doctora Pagels da un ejemplo también muy interesante. Durante la guerra civil en Estados Unidos, cuando el conflicto era sobre si continuar o abolir la esclavitud, ambos lados del conflicto podían utilizar el libro del Apocalipsis para deshumanizar al otro lado y para verse a sí mismos como los paladines de la luz luchando en contra de las fuerzas de las tinieblas. Y eso es algo que es sumamente peligroso porque, como ya lo dije, se deshumaniza al enemigo y puede llevarte a ti mismo a causar grandes daños.
One of the things that I want to bring to the conversation is that uh, in order to understand this imagery, we really need to understand the context. As I said, this is very, very powerful imagery. And as you stated, um, we have accommodated it to our times like a gazillion times. Um, Ever since I was born, Gorbachev was going to be the Antichrist or the beast or whatever. Today we have the solar eclipse. So my question to you right now is, um, how do we show the relevance or the interpretation of many of these images given the political conflicts and religious conflicts at that time? Maybe the woman clothed with the sun,
Yes.
or the beast or whatever. So can you discuss some of them? We already saw Mount Vesuvius. So lo que le acabo de preguntar a la doctora Pagels es, verdad que ya hemos discutido la relevancia de estas imágenes hoy día, pero necesitamos entender cómo se entendió en aquella época. Por lo tanto, cuál es la relevancia de esta imagen, cómo nos ayudan estas imágenes a entender el pasado, ¿no? En el contexto en que se escribió este libro. Uh-huh.
Yes. I mean, for example, the enemy is pictured here as the beast. And the beast has a number, as you know, the human number, and the number, as many Christians know, is 666. Right? Now, historians realize that that is probably taken from a numerological pattern in which numbers are placed as equivalent to letters. And it could spell out the imperial name of Emperor Nero, who was known by everybody, whether Romans or not, to be absolutely the worst, despotic, horrible ruler, disgraced. So the beast is probably code for Nero at the time. And as you said, the woman clothed with, well, the whore of Babylon, that's taken from the book of Isaiah, in which the prophet Isaiah, 600 years before writing, says that Babylon, Israel's ancient enemy, the people who had victory in war over Israel 600 years earlier, Babylon is the whore. The city of Babylon is pictured as the whore of Babylon, who's going to be terribly punished by God. And then there's the woman clothed with the sun, who gives birth to the Messiah. Who is she? Christians later will say she is Israel. She is Mary, the mother of the Messiah. But in John's context, she was probably Israel. In the history of Christianity, though, for example, in the religious wars in Europe between Protestants and Catholics, Queen Elizabeth, the Protestant queen, was Queen Elizabeth I in the 16th century, was pictured by Protestants as the woman clothed with the sun who gives birth to the Messiah, while the whore of Babylon is her enemy. Catholics pictured Queen Elizabeth as the whore of Babylon. So you could take the same image. The same happened with Martin Luther, who started the rebellion against the Catholic Church. Lutherans said that Luther, is a hero, and the enemies of Luther said he is the beast with 7 heads, which for John of Patmos probably referred to the dynasty of Roman rulers. But again, this dreamlike image would allow you to play it in many different ways. So you can find out a first century context, very specific one, as you said, for these images, but then they can be played in almost any context.
La doctora Pagels afirma, ¿verdad?, que uno podría tomar algunas de estas imágenes, como por ejemplo el caso de la prostituta de Babilonia, Babilonia representando, ¿verdad?, las fuerzas de Roma, versus la mujer que está vestida de sol con la luna bajo los pies, en su cabeza una corona de 2 estrellas, que es símbolo probablemente de Israel, ¿verdad? Y entonces se ve ese contraste entre las dos mujeres, además de la bestia, ¿verdad? Que probablemente es Nerón César, el número 666. Probablemente se trate de ¿verdad?, de la gematria, de asignar letras al nombre de Nerón, ¿verdad?, para que dé 666. Pero como ella trae a colación esta imagen que, ¿verdad?, habla de asuntos del pasado, se acomoda también a distintas circunstancias, como por ejemplo, cuando hubo conflictos entre católicos y protestantes, se utilizó bastante estas imágenes para demonizar a la reina Isabel, ¿verdad?, como la prostituta de Babilonia, o por ejemplo, en el caso de Martín Lutero, que utilizó también la imagen del dragón de 7 cabezas y 10 cuernos, ¿verdad?, para hablar de Roma, ¿verdad?, si me acuerdo de la imagen. Así que esos son puntos bien interesantes.
And when, as you know, as Professor Rosario said, when you take a political conflict, for example, in the United States right now, there's a lot of conflict about immigration. These images are very powerful. And we have, as you know, a presidential candidate who is now characterizing himself as the risen Messiah and using Christian imagery and saying that the people trying to enter this country for asylum are not humans. Right? It's that kind of emotional power that this kind of vision of good against evil calls up in people. It's not rational at all anymore. You're not dealing with a practical question. You're dealing with a psychological fantasy of destruction and salvation. I mean, you're dealing with good against evil, and there's no middle ground. It's only one side is right.
Sí, la respuesta de la doctora Pagels es que esto se acomoda a unos conflictos políticos también en Estados Unidos. Por ejemplo, el caso de la inmigración en los Estados Unidos, tenemos un candidato presidencial que se presenta ante sus seguidores como una especie de Mesías resucitado, por así decirlo. Y entonces, en el caso de los inmigrantes, se les presenta como personas no humanas, ¿verdad?, como unas bestias, en cuyo caso, ¿verdad?, hay una polarización de buenos y malos en ese tipo de mentalidad y no hay punto medio. Así es que esa imagen que trae a colación el Apocalipsis sirve mucho para ese tipo de polarización política. Se acomoda ahí bastante bien. Thank you for your response, Dr. Pagels.
Dr. Pagels, I think you've already touched a little bit on this, but I'm going to ask the question directly because I think this is very, very interesting. So, in what ways has the book of John been reinterpreted across history? So we understand that in its original context, the revelation to John was meant to represent symbolically the conflict of early Christianity against the Roman Empire. But outside of that original context, in which ways has this imagery been interpreted and reinterpreted across the centuries?
Well, the first application that I know of in the 7th century, as I said, was when Christians were fighting Muslims in Jerusalem and trying to destroy the Muslims. And as we said, I mean, very importantly, it's not one person who's targeted as evil. It's a whole group of people who are entirely evil and must be destroyed. So it's Christians against Muslims. That's one traditional way it's been used. It was used also by Catholics against Protestants and Protestants against Catholics at the same time. It's been used in contemporary conflicts now in Israel, as you said, very much so. By people of Israel against their enemies, by Jews against Christians. It's entirely polarizing. Those are only a few. When I speak about it, I look at many wars, and in every war that involves Christians, this book has been engaged on the side of, usually, of both sides. And now, of course, it's being used in the Middle East between Christians and Muslims who use apocalyptic imagery against each other in precisely this way.
Le pedí a la doctora Pagels si es que nos puede dar algunos ejemplos sobre cómo las imágenes del libro del Apocalipsis han sido utilizadas fuera de su contexto histórico. O sea, en el contexto histórico original en el que fue escrito, estas imágenes eran simbólicas del conflicto entre la iglesia primitiva y la sociedad grecorromana, la sociedad del Imperio Romano. Pero evidentemente a través de los siglos, estas imágenes flexibles como son del libro de Juan han sido reinterpretadas varias veces. Ella nos comenta de que una de las primeras grandes reinterpretaciones que hubo fue ya en el siglo VII, durante el conflicto entre los cristianos y los musulmanes, ¿no? Y en ese contexto, el libro de Juan sirvió para entender esta nueva religión que aparecía, el Islam, ya no simplemente como un fenómeno aislado, sino que se lo veía como la encarnación del mal. Se lo empezó a entender como una manifestación de los poderes demoníacos, y el libro del Apocalipsis sirvió para enmarcar ese conflicto como un conflicto entre nosotros los buenos y ellos los malos. Ella nos comenta que este libro ha servido en otros momentos históricos, ha servido en tiempos más recientes en el conflicto que existe en el Medio Oriente durante la invasión a Irak. Hoy en día está siendo utilizado para interpretar el conflicto israelí y palestino. O sea, en cada ocasión ha servido en la Edad Media para los católicos lo utilizaban en contra de los protestantes contra los católicos. Siempre que hay un conflicto de gran escala, este libro se presta para ser reinterpretado una nueva vez y enmarcar ese conflicto como una especie de lucha entre el bien y el mal.
You know, it's so important, I think, that you brought up this topic today, because it's not a simple question at all. I wouldn't say it's a bad book. It's a very powerful book. And I would guess, many of us here would agree that there is good in the world and there is evil. We know it when we see it. After I worked on this book, I wanted to say, I'm not willing to talk about this person is good and that person is evil. But when there are deeds, say, massacring innocent people, that is an evil thing, right? We know good and we know evil, and we know about justice and we know about oppression. We see it, and we all hope for a world in which there's a new creation and there's justice and peace and beauty, and everyone lives happily. So there's a great deal of hope and spiritual power invested in this book. It's just that it can be used in ways that are detrimental to the very values that it speaks about. Quite powerful.
I feel that's probably it's not only the book, it's a bit of human nature. I have the feeling that in today's political discourse, polarization is making much more common to dehumanize whoever's on the other side, on both sides of the spectrum. So for example, it worries me, but I start seeing this rise in conspiracy theories, for example,
Yes.
in which you think of the elites as these pedophiles and these
Yes.
they drink the blood of children, and it's some really crazy things, and that's it. To me, that's a symptom that you do, at least in the modern world, in contemporary discourse. It's becoming so much easier to simply demonize the enemy. And I feel that the book of Revelation was probably something like that happening 2,000 years ago.
Yes, I think it was. And yet, you know, the people who are deeply captured by its imagery, as you say, they often deeply believe that they are in the right. And it kind of obliterates looking at a situation in a practical way, like a contest over land, a contest over property, a contest over political power disappears in this sort of blazing conflict between demonic and heavenly forces. It kind of takes over the mind in a way that makes it very hard to come to a human solution of human problems.
Right. La doctora Pagels, yo le empecé preguntando sobre cómo este libro ha sido utilizado en diferentes contextos. Y ella hace el comentario de que el libro de por sí tiene un poderoso mensaje espiritual, tiene una fuerza espiritual muy grande, la cual se presta para el abuso y la distorsión. Y ella no quiere de que esto se malinterprete como una crítica en contra del libro como tal. O sea, el libro tiene este poderoso mensaje de esperanza, que en el fondo dice que al final de todas las cosas hay un Dios bueno, de que se encargará y garantiza de que al final del día las cosas vayan a ser, van a estar restauradas, la justicia va a prevalecer. Pero esta misma fuerza espiritual es fácilmente corrompible. Nosotros podemos entender, nosotros podemos ver el bien y el mal en el mundo, podemos, por ejemplo, creo que todos estaríamos de acuerdo de que si hay una gran catástrofe, si hay una gran masacre, eso es algo que es malo. A la vez nosotros podemos ver la belleza del mundo, podemos ver un amanecer, podemos ver un bosque florido y decir que eso es bueno. Y esa es la esencia del libro, ¿no? Existe el bien y existe el mal y existe este conflicto entre el bien y el mal. El problema es cuando este marco dualista y simplista se trata de aplicar a conflictos humanos complejos. Entonces, la doctora Pagels nos habla de que cuando este marco dualista, buenos contra malos, nosotros contra ellos, se aplica a problemas humanos complejos, es muy difícil llegar a una solución práctica. Entonces, porque ya no estamos hablando, por ejemplo, en el caso de Israel contra Palestina, ya no estamos hablando de un simple conflicto sobre tierra, sino que se convierte en un conflicto sobre la luz contra la oscuridad. Ya no estamos hablando en la política moderna, ya no estamos hablando simplemente de cómo mejor implementar, cómo mejor organizar nuestra economía, sino que se convierte en un conflicto. Nosotros somos los que estamos a favor de Dios y ellos son los paganos que están en contra de ellos. Entonces, es una forma de pensar que puede ser sumamente tóxica y puede fácilmente empeorar un problema que en el fondo es un problema práctico, que necesita una solución humana, y convertirlo en un problema ya de índole cósmica, que no admite una solución salvo destruir al otro.
Sí. Okay. I want to direct a question by one member of our audience, and then a question that I have to finish the conversation. Do you think that the book of Revelation was written by a single author or multiple authors? And my second question is, there is something not being discussed right now, and that is the letters to the churches. At the very beginning
Yeah.
of the book of Revelation. So, if you can answer both of these questions, what is the relevance, of the seven letters, their meaning, the way they have been reinterpreted, etc. Le acabo de preguntar a la doctora Pagels en torno a la pregunta que hizo Alejandro de Amico, si Juan, ¿verdad? El autor del Apocalipsis fue uno o múltiples, y en segundo lugar, el significado de las 7 cartas de Juan al principio del Apocalipsis.
Most people that I have read think there is one author because the language is quite consistent. It was, as you know, attributed to the person who wrote the Gospel of John, which I think is most unlikely. That was even debated in the 3rd century by Christian bishops. There was a great controversy about whether this book belonged in the Bible at all, whether it was true prophecy or false. And very early, it was enormously debated. But I think it is the work of one author. Secondly, the letters to 7 churches speak to churches very close to the place where John writes, on Patmos. They are in today's Turkey primarily. And there are conflicts in the churches between different understandings of the message of Jesus already in the 1st century. So this author has a very strict view that the world is coming to an end very soon. As Paul said, it was coming within our lifetime. There's not time to get married. There's not time to do anything. Just get ready for the end time. So this author believes that, I think, is passionately convinced of that, and writes, with a passion for justice, which that's the tricky part of it. It makes dehumanizing people feel like the right and good thing to do.
Según la respuesta de la doctora Pagels, en primer lugar, ella piensa que, según los autores que ella ha consultado, el libro de Apocalipsis fue escrito probablemente por un solo autor. Entonces, hubo un debate, hubo ciertos debates en torno a su autoría. Incluso hubo debates en torno a si este libro debería pertenecer a la Biblia o al canon del Nuevo Testamento o no. En las cartas ocurren dentro de un contexto histórico muy importante, y es el contexto en el que esto parece terminar pronto, ¿verdad? O sea que las cartas deben entenderse dentro de ese contexto, y que el autor interpreta que, ¿verdad? Y esto es algo que reflejan las 7 cartas a las iglesias, que es algo aceptable, la demonización del otro, ¿verdad? Como es parte de esta retórica de los buenos y los malos, ¿verdad? Nosotros somos los buenos. I imagine that you're referring to the fact that in each letter, the author is talking about what is acceptable, what I praise you for, but then I reject you for this other thing, ¿verdad? O sea, en otras palabras, que cada carta tiene su componente de felicitaciones, pero a la misma vez de condena, ¿verdad? Especialmente a ciertos sectores de ese grupo.
It's interesting to see this, that as early as John writes, before the end of the 1st century, followers of Jesus are divided about what they should believe and who is right. Are we right? Are you right? Because both of us can't be right. So John of Patmos says Jesus has told him who to rebuke and who to praise in the 7 letters.
Ella dice que es bien interesante el hecho de que antes del siglo I, ¿verdad? Antes del final del siglo I, los seguidores están divididos en cuanto al mensaje. Y obviamente lo que hace Juan es representar la postura de Jesús, porque Jesús se le apareció a él y le dijo todas estas cosas, ¿verdad? De felicitar a algunos en contra de otros cristianos del movimiento cristiano de esa época.
I have a couple of questions which might actually be kind of hard to answer, but here I go. My first question is, do you think that there is a Jewish text underneath the book of Revelation? Because if you read Revelations, it seems a very, very, very Jewish text until the moment in which Jesus appears, and so it seems very Jewish. So I don't know if maybe John had the inspiration of a previous Jewish apocalyptic text, and that's a question. And the other question to me is, do you think that John, or in general people who wrote these apocalypses, they had genuine visions, genuine mystical experiences, or this is just a literary trope that they're using to express their messages?
Those are such good questions. Very important questions. First of all, very Jewish text. I mean, this man was not yet, he wouldn't call himself a Christian. We didn't even have that word in the 1st century. He's a very conservative Jewish thinker. And the habit of calling your enemies animals is part of the Hebrew Bible. In Genesis, you may remember, Ishmael, presumed to be the father of the Arab people, is called a wild ass of a man, hated by everyone. That's in Genesis. In the Psalms, the Lord says, supposedly, I will drive those people out of their land before you like locusts. And this has been used by a recent Israeli prime minister. It's biblical language. So it is based very much on Jewish prophecy. I'm not confident there's a Jewish text, but this book is saturated with allusions to Ezekiel, to Daniel, to Zechariah, to Isaiah. I mean, it's just packed with the imagery that comes out of those prophetic texts, for one thing. So yes, it is very much in that tradition. John sees himself as a prophet like Isaiah, or Daniel, or Zechariah. The second question, wait a minute, remind me. It's a very important question.
Do you think that, actually, let me translate your answer and then, or your first question, and then I'm going to go, I want to repeat the second question.
Yes, I remember. Go ahead.
Yeah. Le pregunté a la doctora Pagels, le hice 2 preguntas. La primera, sobre si es que ella cree que detrás del libro del Apocalipsis que tenemos hoy existe algún substrato de algún otro libro apocalíptico que era puramente judío, porque si uno lee el Apocalipsis realmente es un libro que podría ser perfectamente escrito por un judío hasta que aparece Jesús en un caballo, ¿no? Entonces le pregunté si es que creía que había un sustrato judío detrás del libro. Y la segunda pregunta que le hice, la que me va a contestar más adelante, es si es que ella cree de que los autores de estos textos, incluyendo a Juan de Patmos, tuvieron experiencias místicas genuinas detrás de estos textos, o si esta simplemente es una forma literaria de expresar un mensaje, ¿no? Entonces, respecto a la primera pregunta, ella me dice de que no cree que realmente haya otro texto anterior a este, o un sustrato de otro texto anterior a este, sino que el propio Juan, él está pensando en un mundo judío, él está pensando dentro de una cosmovisión judía. Él mismo no se hubiera entendido a sí mismo como un cristiano. O sea, y en el siglo I todavía esa distinción tan radical que tenemos hoy en día entre judíos por un lado y cristianos por otro no hubiera tenido ese sentido. Entonces, él está utilizando imágenes bíblicas para escribir su texto. Y la doctora Pagels apunta de que en la Biblia hebrea ya existía esta tradición de deshumanizar al oponente. Ya, por ejemplo, en el libro del Éxodo se compara a los enemigos de Israel a langostas, ¿no? Entonces se dice, yo voy a ahuyentar a tus enemigos como si fueran langostas. Y estas son imágenes que reaparecen en el libro del Apocalipsis. Entonces el autor se ve a sí mismo como un judío escribiendo en un medio judío y está recogiendo estas imágenes y las está utilizando en su libro. Y ahora la doctora va a proceder a contestar la segunda pregunta.
Yes, your second question. Do you think these are based on actual mystical experiences? It's a very good question. I was taught at Harvard, and I've heard my colleagues teach at Princeton, and many scholars all over the world will try to reduce them to textual issues, to just borrowing from other people's thinking. Now, it could be that. There's plenty in this text, as we saw, that draws richly upon the Hebrew Bible in every way. But I'm also of the view that this author is writing about powerful experiences he has. I imagine him lying out on an island at night. There's no ambient light. There's only stars and moon at night, and looking at the constellations and having visions. It happens. And we've been talking about the liabilities of the book and how it can dehumanize human conflict. And I think that is so important. That impresses me very much. But at the same time, what makes it complicated, why we're talking about it, is that this book has powerful religious conviction and passion in it, passion for justice, a sense of desire for God's victory and peace on earth. So that's what is so mixed into it. And that's why people become so captivated by the power of this book. It's a very complex package, and I'm so happy that you've given us an opportunity to speak about some of those issues.
Thank you. Bueno, yo le pregunté a la doctora Pagels si es que ella creía que detrás del libro existe una genuina experiencia mística, y ella me dice de que académicamente normalmente hay un cierto escepticismo a esto. Normalmente uno, cuando analiza el libro del Apocalipsis o los libros apocalípticos en general, los académicos tienden a tratar de entender los símbolos en términos literarios, en entenderlo como alusiones a la Biblia hebrea o alusiones a otros textos. Pero ella dice, es totalmente posible de que detrás de esto haya una genuina experiencia mística. Nos podemos imaginar a Juan de Patmos en su isla en una noche oscura, solamente iluminada por las estrellas, teniendo una genuina experiencia mística. Y eso es lo que es complicado al momento de tratar de estudiar este libro. En este libro hemos, a través de esta conversación, hablado quizás sobre todo de los aspectos peligrosos o negativos del libro, la tendencia como de este libro a prestarse a deshumanizar a otras personas o a empeorar conflictos. Pero dentro de este libro hay una genuina pasión religiosa, pasión por la justicia, pasión por una fe ferviente de que al final de todas las cosas existe un Dios que es bueno y es un Dios que calmará el sufrimiento humano. Entonces, en el momento de dar una evaluación crítica a este libro, tratar de evaluarlo, es muy complicado tratar de desencadenar, deslinkear ambos aspectos. La doctora Pagels ha sido sumamente generosa con su tiempo y ya vamos a proceder a cerrar esta sesión. Dr. Pagels, you've been very, very, very generous with your time, and we're very grateful to having you. This has been a very, very interesting hour, a very interesting conversation that we've had.
Well, thank you. You are so knowledgeable, both of you, about the text. I love that. And, it's the power of religion is like that. It can be used in many different ways, and I think we need to respect the power of it and treat it with care.
Yeah. There is an element of the book of Revelations giving hope, especially the last chapters of the book, where Jerusalem, descends
Yes.
from the heavens, etc. So it's a very mixed bag of demonizing the other, but at the same time, looking forward to a sort of uh, hope for the best,
Yes.
So it's lo que acabo de decir es que una de las características del Apocalipsis es que es una mezcla de la demonización del otro y todo lo demás, ¿verdad? Mientras que a la misma vez nos ofrece un panorama de esperanza futura, ¿verdad? A la que se aspira. So this has been a great conversation, and I'm glad to have had the opportunity to talk to you again.
I'm very happy to talk with you both. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
So I think we finish this conversation. Terminamos esta conversación agradeciendo a la doctora Pagels por su tiempo. Ha sido sumamente generosa por su tiempo y espero verla de nuevo. We hope to see you again.
Very much. Let's do that. Thank you.
Okay. Take care. Okay.